There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and another episode of Zooming In, which is an occasional series where I engage with bookish social media luminaries the world over about bookish literary articles online. And oh my God, it's BookTube Royalty Day here on my channel. Eric Karl Anderson is joining me. Hello, Eric.
Hello, my Canadian sister.
Bow down before my queen. It's all these rumors about the queen being dead are not true at all.
Well, yeah, Madonna always said there could only be one queen in England, but now there is not an actual queen. There's the king. So does that mean I can be the queen? I don't know.
Well, we do have a Queen Camilla, but maybe we shouldn't even mention that. But was she, by the way, was she at the Booker? I didn't see her at the Booker.
No, well, weirdly, she usually was, but I don't know, maybe
Yeah.
because she's queen now, she isn't able to. But they did have an event with her a few days before the ceremony where
I
all
saw
of the
that.
authors met her. So yeah, so usually during my vlog thing, like I'll like rush over when I see the authors speaking with Camilla and try to film a bit of their interaction, but I wasn't able to on this occasion.
Speaking of queens, we're here to discuss an essay by Virginia Woolf, and it's from the Yale Review. It was originally published there September 1st, 1926,
Mm.
and it's available on their website. It's called How Should One Read a Book? And I'm not sure this is Virginia Woolf's subtitle, but the subtitle is Read as If One Were Writing It. It's a wonderful essay, and I'm very curious to hear what Eric Karl Anderson made of it.
Well, yeah, I really enjoyed it. Her strategy for how we should read, I think, chimes a bit with how I've instinctually read books, in that I tend to always, and I don't know if this is because when I was younger, I did creative writing, but I've always felt a real natural affinity for writers, and so when I read books, I tend to try to like meet them on their own ground when thinking about them, approaching their work, and it's probably why I have a like reputation of being like very nice in all of my responses to books, because I when I read something, I really try to think like, well, what is the author trying to do here? What ideas were they working with? And really trying to meet them on their own ground, and then think like, well, is this actually a good book? And that's basically what Virginia Woolf is suggesting, like trying to give a helpful suggestion of how to approach books, by first, characterizing and acknowledging that there are many different kinds of books there, of between nonfiction and fiction and poetry, and naturally we'll read all of these different kinds of things differently, but also every author has their own unique voice and way of describing similar things, or might, if you have the same idea, two different authors will approach it from totally different ways. And she gives this wonderful example of, she says, well, imagine a scene of meeting a beggar, and how would Daniel Defoe write that, and then how would Jane Austen write that, and how would Thomas Hardy write that, and she characterizes how she thinks those authors would approach those things in ways which feel very believable in how those authors tend to write. And for people who have read any of those three authors much at all will probably understand, there's a kind of type of writing which comes with these particular authors, and the same is true with so many authors. And so she sort of suggests how, well, actually it's very easy to summarize what she talks about in this article, because towards the end there's a paragraph where she's summing it up. So why don't I just read that aloud, because
Great.
she sums it up herself. So she says, so then, to sum up the different points we have reached in this essay, have we found any answer to our question, how should we read a book? Clearly no answer that will do for everyone, but perhaps a few suggestions. In the first place, a good reader will give the writer the benefit of every doubt. The help of all his imagination will follow as closely, interpret as intelligently as he can, In the next place, he will judge with the utmost severity. Every book he will remember has the right to be judged by the best of its kind. He will be adventurous, broad in his choice, true to his own instincts, yet ready to consider those of other people. This is an outline which can be filled in at taste and at leisure. But to read something after this fashion is to be a reader whom writers respect. It is by the means of such readers that masterpieces are helped into the world. And and so I love this way of her suggesting of approaching books almost like as if you were the writer yourself in reading it, in trying to understand how it's constructed, what sort of worlds the author is creating in this book. And then once you finish the book, then standing out, and she used this example of like the accused and the judge in a courtroom. And so you start off as the accused, trying to see it from their point of view, and then you get to be the judge, and then you get to stand aside and say, how good is this book actually? And to try to give your critical opinion of it. And I feel like this is so much of what we're doing in booktube and all the online bookish chat, and it feels like such a helpful way of framing it, because I feel like you get so many different kinds of reader responses, and sometimes readers feel like they approach a book with their own criteria and what they want from that book in mind. And so if the author is doing something slightly different, then that will just bristle with the reader, and then they'll respond to it negatively. And sometimes I feel like you get responses to books from readers that say, well, this was a horrible book, but then don't break down necessarily why they think it's horrible, because they might think it's horrible just because that wasn't the kind of reading experience that they were looking for. Or it might be, that they've really thought about what the author was trying to do and decided that actually they weren't very successful in that. And I just found myself very sympathetic with Virginia Woolf's way of approaching reading and responding to books. But how did you feel about the article?
Well, I thought that some of this essay and some of what you've just said, it felt like you were talking to 2017 version of Sean the Bookmaniac. Hated a lot of books, perhaps prematurely, putting the cart before the horse. I'm softening in my old age, and you are changing too, because you do more, I don't know if the right word is make negative reviews, but we hear more about what you don't like, and even sometimes what you can't finish than we used to. So you and I are kind of meeting in the, not maybe the middle, but it's interesting because
it's true. It does seem that way.
Right?
Yeah.
I would like to read the 2-sentence nugget of what you just said, because she just has such a way with words. If you haven't read her, to read a book well, one should read it as if one were writing it. Begin not by sitting on the bench among the judges, but by standing in the dock with the criminal. Be his fellow worker, become his accomplice. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great.
When I was an English major, literary theory, this sounds like, and I've actually forgotten what the name of that, you might remember what that era of literary criticism was called, where the intention of the writer is everything, or primary. It's the primary thing that you're looking for when you read critically. And it's a pretty old school of literary criticism. And it's probably came out around the time she may have started it, for all I know. But there's lots of postmodernist, post-structuralist theories that would just be rolling their eyes at the conversation that we're having about Virginia's great ideas, but that's fine. Yes, but one of the things that was revelatory for me was the way that she talked about if you took a similar scene, what was it, an old man in the street or something, and what Defoe would do with that, what Austen would do with that, and then what Hardy would do with that. And I just found that so masterful. And it really did make me think, I'd like to enlarge my vision about what writers do in this way, so that I could talk, I'll never be able to talk about literature the way she does, but wow. I thought it might be fun to take that perspective to see if you and I could kind of sketch out the voice, the worldview, the the vision of our some of our favorite writers. For example, Joyce Carol Oates. How would you describe her vision or her voice? And I'm putting a 17-minute time limit on your answer.
Yeah. How long do you want me to go on? So it's kind of helpful. Recently, there was an article in the New Yorker, very long article about Joyce Carol Oates and kind of characterizing her and her career. And within that, the journalist had interviewed Edmund White, who's been a long time friend of Joyce Carol Oates. And he characterized a typical Joyce Carol Oates story would be you would see like an adolescent girl who's quite meek and who's small chested and who's clutching a book to her chest and racing through a dark night as a murderous man is pursuing her. And that is almost a prototypical like Joyce Carol Oates short story. And Joyce Carol Oates talks about herself that she so often writes about the lives of adolescent girls and teenage girls, and this just seems to be where her creative imagination lies a lot of the time. Part of the reason why I love her so much is that there really isn't, even though you could say this is like typical Joyce Carol Oates type scenario, she writes in so many styles about so much different subject matter, so many different times and places that really, her imagination can get gothic and strange and wild, but she can also write these really tense, gripping thrillers, but also writes about this psychological realism in such a striking and memorable way. And I feel like she's kind of like a shapeshifter in her writing style. And so that often when I read her books, I can pick out maybe moments or certain turns of phrase and say, oh yeah, this is a real Joyce Carol Oates thing to do. But then other times there are stories and places that her imagination go into which surprise me so much. And so even though I've read so much of her work, I feel like she's still an author that keeps me on my toes in that way. And so that's part of the reason why I love her work so much. And that's my answer. But what about you and your...
And that was 16 minutes and 58 seconds. So well done.
Phew.
I'll try to talk about Barbara Pym in a second, but I was thinking, listening to you very intently and thinking, now, who would she most be like of the three that Woolf kind of diagrammed out? Maybe Hardy.
Yeah,
but
I was going to say,
not
yeah,
very
I think she's more of a Thomas Hardy sort of, that's
fate and destiny and dark at his worst, or the thing people criticized Hardy was for melodrama, and maybe Joyce Carol Oates, some people would say that too. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's true. And he often wrote about like he describes the natural world in his work quite a lot, as does Joyce Carol Oates. She's like always describing the sky, and that kind of relates to the emotional mood of the story. Yeah.
For me, Barbara Pym, it's an easy comparison. She is kind of Jane Austen's heir, and her stuff is most of her stuff, not all, absolutely not all, but most of her novels were comedies of manner, and they were concerned, obviously, social relationships. The protagonists were usually, but not always, single women, spinsters, or widows, and incredibly funny for me anyway. Not only me, but I don't know if her humor would float everyone's boat, but I don't know how many times I've almost peed my pants reading Barbara Pym. And not every Barbara Pym fan talks about this, but for me, there is a fabulously rich undertow in that when you're reading her fiction, you're never sure, am I laughing with the protagonist or am I laughing at the protagonist? Because it's just nonsensical stuff, and they're kind of, described by Barbara Pym or by themselves as not beautiful, a little bit chubby, over the hill, and messy hair or whatever. And underneath all that, there is such a powerful yearning for connection and yearning for love that, to me, makes Barbara Pym's novels profound, not just comedies of manners. So that's how I would describe. And lots of tea, lots and lots of tea. and Vickers, young hot Vickers. So
Oh, that's always good.
she certainly creates a world. I was also fascinated by how she talked about nonfiction. She didn't use the word palate cleanser, but that's what I thought she was kind of getting at. Like if you get too deep into something, poetry or fiction, and you're kind of over your head, or you've kind of reached a block with this particular writer, put it down and pick up a biography. What did you make
Yeah,
of that part?
just some facts. Well, I think it felt like it reflects more, her natural affinity in her reading tastes, of that she's more drawn to the fiction and symbolic, sort of like creative turn of imagination rather than the facts. I'm sure a lot of people that are more have a natural affinity to nonfiction would like probably object to her way of characterizing
They
or
might, and they
describing.
might turn it on its head and say, when I want to, take a break, I'll pick up a novel. It could be the reverse. And I love the fact that she allows for that and the way she concludes the essay. I mean, if this doesn't speak to you, then do your own thing. But I'm, kind of through this essay giving you permission to do your own thing. And I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And also, I feel like she is acknowledging too that there's a lot of, even though, we have these categories for literature, and it's a statement that's always said about, genres and stuff, that we put books in these boxes or these certain spaces on the shelves, but really there's a lot of bleeding into each other of writing between fiction and nonfiction and poetry. And so it's, you can't really, especially with novels, it's why novels are called novels, because every time the author is doing something unique in that book, which gives a different slant on narrative, which utilizes narrative to try to distill their ideas and their voice in a unique way. Yeah.
And if I understood her correctly, what I felt one of the things I thought she was saying was that if you, and again, that kind of a reader like her, who prioritizes fiction over nonfiction, that you read some nonfiction and then you find yourself your imagination starts firing because you want to make the connections that only novelists would make between the
Mm.
facts that she's presenting, and that leads you back with a kind of refreshed mind to maybe puzzle through the novel that was defeating you a few days or a few weeks ago. And so I'd like to, if you're willing, one of the things that was the most inspiring about this essay for me was this indefatigability that she is describing about don't give up. Just, if you're with a writer or a book that is really difficult and she's giving strategies and stuff, but that's something I needed to hear, and that really gave me a lot of energy. And now I can't help but think about you, putting you on the spot, and we can edit all this out if you don't want to go there. But you bailed on Sarah Bernstein's Study for Obedience, and then you went back to it later
Mm.
and had a fairly positive experience. So can you riff on that in conjunction with the Virginia Woolf idea of indefatigability?
I had a real trouble saying that word too. Yeah. Using that as an example, Sarah Bernstein's novel, I think it relates partly to how we as readers often are just reading for pleasure. And since we are mostly just reading for pleasure, that if a book strikes us as something we are not enjoying fairly early on in the book, then we are happy to put it aside and go read something else, because there are so many books to get to. And I have definitely in recent years started DNFing books much more often. Whereas I think when I was younger, I felt this real like dogged sense of like, well, no, I've started this book. Now I have to finish it. Now I have to try to understand it, especially if it was a well-regarded book or something that I felt like I should have read. And so would like push myself to keep reading it, where in so many of those experiences, when I've done that and forced myself to get through a book, I, at the end of it, did not enjoy the experience, did not remember much from the book. And so it ended up feeling feeling like wasted time. Now, in the case with Sarah Bernstein's novel, when I started reading that and really did not get on with it, found it really frustrating, but was telling myself with that like old voice that I had of like, no, this is a prize nominated book. You should like keep reading it. It's not very long. Just get through it. But then I got to a point after a few days where I was just like, no, no more. I'm not gonna. I'm gonna put this aside and not read it. And so I was glad to do so, and would have been glad to leave it aside. But then having so many readers say like, no, really, you should try giving this book another chance, and seeing such strong critical opinions of it of readers that I really trusted and who are making really great points about the book that I hadn't really thought of before when I was trying to read it without really knowing anything about the story except for what was on the summary on the inside flap. And I think because I'd like left it aside for long enough, that like that initial irritation I felt with it had like subsided somewhat, and so just read it like afresh, and also in a way that I sort of knew what to expect and knew not to go into it looking for a traditional kind of story, expecting a like plot and a central character that I'd really root for. And, you know, and so many of us, when we go to read fiction, I think we really want a protagonist that we can root for and feel like get alongside. Whereas this protagonist, I found incredibly irritating in her manner and approach to things. But that's part of the book's greatness, I think, in that she really forces you into this different kind of perspective that you probably wouldn't like to inhabit otherwise, in a perspective you might not feel something that I didn't feel something. I always do this thing when talking about books. I say like you, when really I should own it and say, no, this is how I responded to it. And I've been told off in the comments before of saying like, stop saying you, say I, own your statements. And yeah, so a protagonist I found really difficult to get on with, that I didn't sympathize with, and that I got very frustrated with. But then trying to see more the subtlety, I think, of what Sarah Bernstein was doing in that novel, and well, really discovering it by continuing to read throughout it and read the entire book, had a much more like intense, immediate experience of it. Whereas at first, I, because I had this more emotional reaction, that it made reading it so much more laborious and difficult to get through. So yeah, I think that was my experience with that book. And but like, you know, I said, even while I was reading it and appreciating so many aspects of it, I wasn't finding it an enjoyable experience as I normally like to have when going to reading books. There's a lot about it I found difficult and frustrating in its like intentional way of obscuring certain things and not letting you into the story. But again, I think that's all part of how the narrator doesn't know certain things or can't organize her thoughts in that way, like because of the way she's been raised and her position in the world. And so yeah, it was a fascinating experience, and a rare example of like a book that I returned to and that I initially disliked so much, but was glad to do that. But I'm curious, are there books that have had that effect with you? And also, have you read Study for Obedience? What did you think of it?
I have not read it, but I bought it, I think probably because you bailed on it. I thought, oh, that Eric bailed on this. I have to check it out myself. And other people loved it. And so the positive reviews also seduced me. I have to see it. So I haven't read it yet. I don't usually go back and pick up books I bail on, but I've done it at least twice. And one was I bailed again the second time earlier in the book than I had the first time. So then I thought, okay, I'm never going to try another bail ever again, because I know that my reaction is my reaction, and life's too short to be picking up books I've already bailed on. But then this one was a little bit different. There's a queer Indigenous writer whose name has gone out of my head. I'll put the book GIF up. And I struggle with his writing. It's very intellectual and kind of homo academic. Not sure if I would almost the right word, but certainly very academic, theoretical
Mm.
writing, but it's fiction
Mhm.
or personal essay. And his second last book was autobiographical essays, and I just hit a dead end with his language. So I bailed, and I announced my bail on a Friday Reads. And one of my dear friends said, "You really need to give this another try because I think there's so much gold in this for you." So
Mm.
I tried it on audio, and I knew from watching him on YouTube videos that I love. He's got a really beautiful gay voice. And so having him read it to me in my ear and having it, then I could get past the fact that I don't love the theoretical verbosity or vocabulary, but that there was gold there for me. So that was a positive experience.
Mm. Oh, yeah, that's really interesting.
So I think Virginia would be proud of us for our at least occasional indefatigabilities.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean,
So
I found it really like on the other side of the coin as someone who's been talking a lot about Virginia Woolf's novel The Waves recently because it was the October choice for my online book club, and a lot of some members had said that they tried to read this book a long time ago and but didn't get on with it at all, and so I found it so fascinating, like a unique challenge of like oh, how can I convert these readers to my favorite book of all time, but also acknowledging and saying to all the members when we started reading this book that I totally accept that this isn't a book for everyone. Not everyone's going to enjoy it, and I completely respect that. And so if you don't get on with this book, please feel free to say so, and don't feel like you're going to hurt my feelings by dissing this book. But a lot of members responded to it very positively, some of who said that they didn't get on with it before. And I think that's partly because of me talking about it with such passion and why I related to it, relate to it, and connect to it so strongly that when they're reading, they could see those aspects that I was really connecting to, even if they didn't necessarily connect with it in the same way themselves, that they could appreciate that aspect of it. But also, it's sort of the same thing of going into study for obedience of I think if you go into a book with different kinds of expectations, and I feel like this is kind of what Virginia Woolf is talking about in her essay too, that if you go into a novel expecting well, I like novels, that have a strong plot, that have a character arc, that have all these traditional markers of what novels often give us, and if you go in just with those expectations, and if the author is doing something quite different, then that can be quite frustrating for a reader. And I think a lot of readers that approach The Waves have that frustration with the book because it is written in such a poetic style that even though you get the points of view of 6 different characters, because it's written this highly stylized manner, it can all feel a bit samey, and so feel like there's no distinction between the characters, and also that there's very little plot. That it's more just describing these sensory experiences and this way of inhabiting the world and consciousness in this sort of strange way. But if you just, as we've said in the group, like the best way to approach it, of like playing upon the title of the novel, is just to let it wash over you. And rather than trying to find a definite meaning and say like, oh yes, this novel is about this, but The Waves, I feel like, can't be interpreted so strictly in one way. I mean, it's describing these characters' lives and their experience in the course of life, and the things that connect us, the things that disconnect us. And so it's about so many like larger things than just a specific story. And it's also saying that we all really have the same story in our lives, and that we all start at a young age, we go through a period of development, we become adults, and then we have to deal with old age if we're lucky enough to get to later stage in our life. And so that we have these commonalities between us, but we also have our own unique way of viewing and understanding the world. And I feel that's kind of what she's talking about in this essay too, that we as readers, we all, in the English language, we all understand the language, we all understand the way sentences are constructed, but we all have our unique point of view. We all have our own way of bringing our own ideas and understanding of the world into stories that give such a different interpretation to it than how another reader would read it. And so, I always think of that thing that I heard Margaret Atwood say once, which I'm sure other authors have said, but that readers, when we go into books, we're not necessarily reading a book, we're really writing the book. We're really like creating it for ourselves, because so much of it is based on not just our experience and history and our own unique viewpoint of the world, but also like our mood in the day, the context in which we're reading a book. We might be having a lot of things going on in our personal life at that particular moment, and so I can't really say. It might just be that I was in the mood for like Sarah Bernstein's novel when I first started to read it. I just might have been in a bad mood that day, and so really reacted really negatively towards it, and then was in a more positive mood. So it's so there are so many factors that go into the reading process, aren't there?
Absolutely. And so my experience with The Waves was almost the opposite of yours. I read it in between my undergrad English degree. I took a few years off, and before I went to grad school, and I read it just as a reader, not as a student. And I just fell into it and fell in love with it. And just I would read passages to my best friend and almost start to cry. It just affected me so deeply. And then so that was my first experience. And then fairly early in my booktube life, I reread it, or was supposed to reread it as a buddy read with somebody. It was the end of the reading year, and I was exhausted, and I couldn't get into it, and I bailed. So exactly what you said. And so I'm going to watch your video, and I bet it's going to make me want to pick it up again. I think we've done this up good, Eric. This was a great
but
discussion.
it's a great article, and I it inspired me because I completely forgot. I got this book a few years ago called Genius in Ink, Virginia Woolf, on how to read. And actually, I've never read it, but it's mostly essays of her, I think, talking about specific authors and writing about them. But there's also some general essays about literature and reading as well. I also wanted to point out I should get brownie points of having a room of one's own mug that I've been drinking from while we've been having our geeky Virginia Woolf conversation. And I also, if you allow me to indulge, I noticed in the Guardian newspaper yesterday, they published this advent calendar for December, of a literary advent calendar, where they give small sections of other authors commenting on the Christmas period. And it's skipping ahead, but on December 15th, it's Virginia Woolf. And there's a great thing in here about Christmas shopping. So Woolf's Christmas shopping expedition, described in a letter to her nephew in 1931, speaks to us nearly 100 years later. And Virginia Woolf wrote, "This is a black, foggy Christmas week, and the human race is distracted and unlovable. That is, I spent yesterday in Oxford Street buying things like gloves and stockings." So I think it's safe to say that Virginia Woolf, if she was alive today, she would do all her Christmas shopping online and avoid all of the bustling, unlovable crowds in London that we have at the moment. As I was out in London yesterday and saw the streets were packed with so many people pushing each other around, and it all gets a bit chaotic around this time.
I only like Christmas shopping for the bookish people in my life. That I enjoy.
Yeah, it's always a good thing.
On that happy note, we have proved fearless. We are not afraid of Virginia Woolf and her reading advice, and this was an absolutely delightful conversation, Eric. I hope you'll come back.
Yeah, it's always wonderful talking with you, Sean. And thank you very much for having me. Yeah, this has been great.